And okay, good. I thought I would use the time to present one extra topic that we had not thought we'd have an opportunity to present, but I think we can do now. Let me make this bigger. There we go. Oop. And let me pull up the chat. Yay, okay. So I think we can just barely squeeze this in. But what I'd like to do is talk about writing a grant proposal. As we talked about earlier, we want to give people an opportunity. We want to encourage people to pursue grant proposal writing because it builds your credibility with researchers, especially with faculty. And as you heard in Bruce's talk earlier this afternoon, it's really valuable to have a sense of how faculty operate, what the constraints on faculty are, in order to be able to meet them in the middle, so to speak, better. And so one component of that is understanding what they do. Part of that is writing grant proposals. And here's a great part, it also can lead to you actually having external funding. That makes you a rainmaker. And being a rainmaker at your institution is very, very valuable. You always have two choices. You're a net cost or you're a net benefit. If you are a net cost, they are constantly evaluating, are you worth the money? If you're a net benefit, then they don't have to ask that question. So let's dive right in. And I want to let you know that much of the content of this talk came from a previous talk by Greg Monaco and Kate Adams of the Great Plains Network. They gave me permission to use this, so I've been reusing it on a number of occasions. And I appreciate them putting together, and then I've made my own adjustments to it. So we'll talk about what we're going to want to cover in this talk, what the proposal process is at the NSF, what the components of a proposal are, and then some additional budgeting issues that are worth being aware of. All right. So what we want is to gain a working knowledge of the grant proposal process at the NSF, and then have a clear idea of what you want to do when you write an NSF proposal or participate in an NSF proposal that somebody else is leading. Look at what the common elements are for proposals, and let's kind of put that together. So here's the thing. The NSF has a place where you submit proposals. Up until recently, and even now still somewhat, but this is going away, the NSF had their own proposal submission system called FastLane. That's now going away and is being replaced by research.gov, which covers, I believe, all of, or at least most of, the federal research funding agencies. For a long time, research.gov actually just pointed you back to FastLane for a lot of things. But my understanding is now that's going to be wrapped up and everything will be internal to research.gov. I think that is not quite the case yet, but I confess that I haven't submitted a proposal since January. So things are evolving fairly rapidly, and I'm not sure what if anybody knows what the status is, please put that in the chat. Once you've submitted the proposal to the NSF, a review process is started, where the program officer or program director, program manager will go through the set of proposals to figure out what's in there. That'll help them select reviewers. There may also be cases where they discover proposals that are somehow breaking the rules and either have to be fixed by the principal investigators or have to be rejected out of hand. Returned without review is the term of art that the NSF likes to use. Then they pick panel dates, they select reviewers. Sometimes it's done in the other order, where based on the reviewers they select, that'll set the panel dates. They put together review criteria. They assign proposals to reviewers, and then the reviewers submit their reviews. Then the NSF program officer, program director, program manager, those terms, by the way, we can, for our purposes, we can use interchangeably. They bring together the review panel either in person, although obviously over the last 15, 16 months, it hasn't been in person. It's typically been over Zoom or equivalent, sometimes on the telephone. And the review panel works together. The reviewers work together to build a consensus about the proposals they're reviewing. Okay, so what about the reviewers? They might be subject matter experts in some area of some of the proposals, or they might not be. I think many of us have been on proposal reviews where there's been different kinds of expertise among the reviewers, different levels of expertise, and that's not a barrier to having successful reviewing process and successful reviews. Having a mix of background and expertise is actually ideal. On your own, before the review panel, you write a review of each of the proposals you've been assigned. You typically are assigned somewhere between a third and a quarter of the proposals that the panel is reviewing, and you'll participate directly in that subset, but you're allowed to make comments about all the other ones as well. When you write your review, you don't know who else, you don't necessarily know who else is going to be on the panel, who else is going to be reviewing the same proposals, and you don't know what they're going to do with the information you provide. You cannot tell people after you've been on a panel, or when you're about to be on a panel, you can't tell other people. I can't tell my wife and kids what panels I'm on, let alone my colleagues, let alone the people who have been, whose proposals I'm reviewing. I'm not allowed to contact them if I'm reviewing. And the panel has no authority, just influence. There are really two kinds of power. There's authority and there's influence. One of those is very direct and the other is very indirect. Panels have tremendous influence and zero authority. They make recommendations, not decisions. So there are more, as I mentioned, most of us as panel members get assigned between a quarter and a third of the proposals on the panel. So you're reviewing, let's say 6 to 8 proposals out of, let's say 15 to 25, and submitting reviews for them to an electronic system, a web-based system. Typically nobody is reviewing all the proposals unless it's a very small panel with very few proposals. Anybody during the panel process, the actual in-person panel, can comment on any proposal, even if they haven't read it. In your proposal, when you're writing a proposal, you can suggest reviewers, but the NSF doesn't have to use your suggestions. You can also request reviewers who shouldn't review the proposal. So if you're a Hatfield who's been feuding with the McCoys, you can request that Professor Jane McCoy not be one of your reviewers. But again, although I think for requests for not to have someone as a reviewer, I think the NSF does try and honor those requests, but I don't think they're actually binding. I strongly recommend that you take every opportunity you have to be a proposal reviewer, because there's no better way to learn how to put together a proposal and to understand what makes proposals successful or unsuccessful than to be a reviewer. You learn so much in that couple of days that there's no other way to learn. You also, except lately in the COVID era, but pre-COVID and post-COVID, you get a free trip to the NSF. So they buy your plane ticket for you, or your train ticket if you live on the Eastern Corridor, or however you want to do it, the Northeast Corridor. Then while you're there, you can book meetings with program officers who you want to submit proposals to, things of that nature. And if you can get a cheaper motel and buy cheaper food and so on, you can actually net some money from the process. Now, if you're doing remote reviews like I did recently, the amount of money is much smaller, but you can still make some money from doing this. So if you like money, this is a way you can make some money. The panel makes recommendations to the program officer. There are 4 categories: highly competitive, competitive, low competitive, and non-competitive. Think of those as morally equivalent to A, B, C, and F. They're not literally that, but boy, that's how they play out. So then the program officer typically is going to have multiple panels for the same program and has to pick proposals to fund from those multiple panels. So what one panel recommends may conflict with what another panel recommends, and the program officer has to make decisions on that. If a particular proposal is selected to be funded, that doesn't, if your proposal is selected to be funded, that doesn't mean you got the money. That's, the money has not banked yet, and it's not guaranteed to bank. You might be contacted by the program officer. That almost always happens in advance of the official announcement, because they often need certain kinds of documentation from you, like an abstract, which is different from the pieces of the proposal that you provided. They may also ask you to change your budget. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the program officer is the one who has the authority to make the decision about funding. But just because they have the authority doesn't mean they can decide willy-nilly whatever the heck they want. They have to be able to justify that to their chain of command, including, perhaps especially, based on the review panel's recommendations. So if a program officer is going to go completely against what the review panel says, they better have a really compelling explanation for why. Which gives you some useful advice. Always make the program officer's job easy. Now, I just spent a lot of time, in fact, I'm not quite done, but I'm spending a lot of time talking about the review process and the program officer and the reviewers. Why am I doing that? Because none of the rest of the stuff will matter unless you're thinking about that part of the process. So we're putting it right up front. So the program officer makes a preliminary decision. That decision is non-binding. There could be reasons why they have to back out of that. As I mentioned, you might be asked to submit some follow-up materials, maybe just an abstract. Maybe you have to submit a new budget. Usually if you have to submit a new budget, it's because they reduced your budget. I did have one grant where they actually increased the budget when they came back and said, we're going to give you the money, but we're going to give you more money than you asked for. I've only had that happen once, and boy, was it fun. You may have to, if they reduce the budget, for example, you may have to write a change to the scope of the project and say what you're not going to be able to do because you have less money. So you have to be quite specific. And all of that is confidential. You are not supposed to tell anybody anything. If they tell you, we're thinking about giving you the money, you keep your mouth shut. You can tell your research office, maybe your co-PIs, although you're pressing your luck there, but nobody else. And then later, usually about 6 months after the due date for the proposals, usually around that time frame, the NSF will officially announce which grants are being awarded. Okay, now back to grant proposals. So some things to keep in mind before you get started. Number one, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's life. I've got a recap of those probabilities to give you the feel for. You got to submit a lot of proposals. I have to submit, to first order, I have to submit 4 proposals if I want one to get funded on average. But on the other hand, you cannot close what you don't propose. If you don't submit the proposal, I promise you, you'll get $0. There are plenty of wonderful proposals that don't get funded because the program they're submitted to doesn't have enough money for all the fantastic proposals. I remember talking to someone who had been a program officer, program officer on a particular program, and he said it was so competitive, they had to look for things like violations of very basic rules about like the margins and stuff, because there were so many amazing proposals that were submitted, far more than they could possibly fund. It happens that reviewers will misunderstand your proposal. Too bad. Don't send a hate mail to the program officer and complain about how they misunderstood your proposal. It happens all the time. That's a signal to you that you need to do a better job explaining. Doesn't mean it's not their fault for that. There might have been a reviewer who was an idiot or a jerk. That certainly does happen. But you have control over the next go round in the sense that you can resubmit and address those issues. And that's really good. So you can think of it as you have control. And historically, resubmits have had a much higher probability of success than the original submission. So original submission, 25%, first resubmit 50%, second resubmit 75%. So things that get better have a higher probability of success. Terrible proposals do occasionally get funded, but not very often. And as I said, it takes a lot of submissions to get it funded. So here's those slides from earlier today with the percentages, just to show you I'm not lying, didn't make this up. Okay, so what are the components? In an NSF proposal, you've got a cover page, you've got a project summary, project description, references, budget and justification, why the budget is the way it is, bio sketches, current and pending support, collaborators and other affiliations, facilities, data management plan, postdoc mentoring plan, and other documents as required by the individual program. I may have left a few out, but that gives you the flavor of it. And every single piece is your opportunity to sell your ideas, to make clear, A, that it's a brilliant idea, and B, that you are the best possible team to implement that idea, to pursue that idea. So think of it as every section of the proposal is enhancing what you are arguing about. Number one rule, read the solicitation. And the number two rule, read the solicitation. If you've got questions, ask. Now, some program officers are much better on the phone. Some program officers are better by email. That's very random, just like in real life with your real life human beings, because of course, program officers are real life human beings. So find out what they respond better to. If they're not responding by email, ask to have a call with them. Read the solicitation. I was on a proposal with a colleague, and the proposal, and in the proposal writing process, I said to the colleague, so I notice on page such and so of the solicitation, this section such and so says this thing. I don't see that in the version you sent me. Is it being addressed? And they were like, oh yeah, it's fine. And then the proposal was returned without review because that thing was not in the proposal. Big waste of time. If they've got a webinar, this is quite common, especially for new programs, attend the webinar, ask questions, get your questions answered, and then read the solicitation. Pay attention to the core components of the solicitation. What are the criteria they're going to use? What are the different areas? If there are sub-programs, what are they? What are you supposed to do? Do you need to submit a pre-proposal or a letter of intent? Are there specific things you're supposed to incorporate? And what are the review criteria? They're the standard review criteria that apply to pretty much every solicitation. But then there are program-specific review criteria. Get to know what they are and address them in a direct and obvious way in the proposal. Do they keep count of how many times you've submitted? They don't, but you can point that out in your proposal. My experience, both as a reviewer and in proposing, my experience has been, if you say this is a resubmit, they are more likely to be sympathetic, particularly if you say, we've addressed the reviewer comments from last time. They're more likely to be sympathetic, and it raises your probability of success. As a reviewer, I love seeing that in the proposal, that they actually bothered to try and fix it in accordance with the feedback they got from reviewers. They're taking seriously what the reviewers say. Of course, I like that as a reviewer. Okay, and of course, read the solicitation. Make a compelling argument, right? A colleague of mine once said, a grant program is a writing contest. The person who writes the best wins, right? Because they can't look at the research you're gonna do in the future. There's no way to do that. They look at the way that you structure your argument, which may include things like look at my amazing track record. But I'll tell you, if all it is look at my amazing track record, you ain't gonna get the money. It's gotta be look at my amazing track record and look at what we are proposing to do and how well thought out it is and how brilliant and how it's going to lead to amazing things. Oh, and read the solicitation. If you can't come up with a compelling argument, have a competent argument. Don't have an idiotic argument. And read the solicitation. Demonstrate that you're aware of what you don't know, that you do know what you don't know. Be honest about it. Don't try and BS your way through it, because there's going to be someone on that review panel who knows the topic better than you do. And of course, read the solicitation. What are you trying to achieve? Give them a reason to say yes. They're looking for reasons to say no because there are always far more good proposals than there's money to go around. They're looking for reasons to say no. Don't make it easy for them to say no. If they're going to say no, at least they should have to earn it. And I just said that, right? Consider what they will think, right? What's going to go through their mind as they're reading the proposal or when they're done reading it, right? I can see where they're going with this. They really know what they're talking about. Well, I didn't know that university had that kind of exciting stuff going on. I can't tell you how many proposals I've read as a reviewer where I'm like, I had no idea, and that's amazing stuff happening at that institution. I had no idea they were doing that, and I'm so excited now that I know that. Or this is going to be so valuable to that institution, right? They really know how to do this properly, right? One of my favorites is seeing that different parts of the institution work well together and they can prove it. Here's something that they did between the administration and the researchers that worked really well. And so they're going to use that. They're going to leverage that relationship to take it to the next level. I love seeing that stuff. And this is a great investment. This is where the NSF should put its money. Everything you put in the proposal should support this. Don't muddy the waters with stuff that's confusing or that kind of takes back from how amazing it is. Yes, be honest, but don't sell yourself short. Okay, so what are we starting with? We start with a cover page. It's got the title, it's got the PI and co-PIs, the institutions, that sort of thing. Then there's the project summary. It's one page. So think of it as the executive summary. And there's 3 sections you must have. And you must have this so hard that now when you submit one of these project summaries, these one-pagers, there's actually 3 text boxes and one for each of these sections. You got to fill them in and not in aggregate exceed a whole page. So you're constantly putting stuff in and then outputting it to a PDF to see whether it's going to be more than one page. If it is, you got to pull back, right? So overview, intellectual merit, broader impacts, absolutely required. Make it easy for the reviewers to figure out what you have in mind. I've read proposals where I went through 14 of the 15 pages and I didn't know what they planned to do. I couldn't understand what it was that they had in mind to do. Make it easy for them to get that right up at the front. Then the project description typically is 15 pages, which sounds like a lot until you're writing, and then it's not nearly enough, right? I once was handed a grant proposal now for a program that would allow 25 pages, and it was 45 pages long. And it was a preliminary, this was not something that had been submitted. This was internal preliminary draft. But I looked at that and I was like, how the heck are you going to cut this thing in half and have it be coherent? So you got to keep the page real estate in mind as you're doing this. Start with some kind of vision. Get into their heads very quickly what it is you have in mind, what it is you want to do. Because if you don't get that in their heads right away, they're going to fill it in with the wrong thing, and you're going to be really sad that they ended up with the wrong thing in their heads. Have a set of 3 or 4 objectives. What do you want the project to accomplish, right? And don't overcomplicate it, don't overdo it. If you have many objectives, it just doesn't seem likely that you can do that with the dollars and the number of months you have, the number of years you have. If you have too few objectives, it doesn't seem like you've really thought through the project. You need to have intellectual merit. You need to clearly label it so that the reviewers know it's there because it's a requirement. You need to have a plan for how you're going to accomplish it. You need to have a plan for broader impacts, again, very clearly labeled. You need to have a management plan, how you're going to run the project, right? And you need to have a way of evaluating that you're doing well, that the project is working well. Now, for many programs, you can do your own evaluation. You just have, for example, a list of metrics and milestones and things of that nature. For some of the larger scale projects, you're often encouraged or even required to have a third party, and often from another institution not participating in the grant, a third-party external evaluator to evaluate the progress. And there are services all over the country that provide that capability. Broader impacts, and there are lots of different areas of broader impacts. I'm not going to read them all out loud, but there's a whole lot of different areas. They've evolved over time, so these may change over time. But the big ones are you're advancing scientific knowledge, you're integrating education and research together, or at least research training, if not education, and you're addressing the underrepresentation of specific populations. So women, underrepresented minorities, people with disabilities, also institution types. So if you are at an R1 or an R2 and you're incorporating value for non-PhD granting institutions, community colleges, K-12 institutions, that's also very popular, things of that nature. There's lots and lots of areas where you can provide broader impacts. You need to incorporate a section on results from prior NSF support. This is a requirement for all NSF proposals, as far as I'm aware. If you've got lots of that, you can't fit it all. The grant proposal guide has some guidelines on that, what you should include, and sometimes there are program-specific requirements or recommendations. But usually it's each of the PI and co-PIs should provide one NSF grant most relevant to the current proposal. And in that, you have to have the intellectual merit in each of these, and it's typically a paragraph for each person, because they have one grant per person. You've got to include a section on intellectual merit, a section on broader impacts, and then a list of publications or a statement that there haven't been any yet. If you don't have anything relevant, just make sure to say that so they don't think you blew it off. And then what I have found is if I can find a way to take that information and build a more coherent story and integrate that with what the proposal is about, that's even more exciting, because then the reviewers can see sort of an arc of progress over time and over multiple projects. Have a management plan. Who's going to do what? How are you going to make decisions? Is it the PI is going to have final authority over everything? Are you going to do a vote? What are you going to do? Describe how you're going to make decisions. Have one or more advisory committees, like an external advisory committee, people from other institutions. Maybe one is about cyber infrastructure, one's a researcher who would use such cyber infrastructure, one's for broader impacts, things like that. You can have an internal advisory committee, things of that nature. In Oklahoma, we have the One Oklahoma Cyber Infrastructure Initiative, so we always have a One Okie advisory committee that you can leverage to do your on your proposals, and anytime I get asked, I'm like, yeah, absolutely, I'm happy to be on your One Okie advisory committee. Include a timeline and some milestones so you can measure the progress you're making, and have a sustainability plan. What are you going to do when the grant expires? Because now you have no more NSF money for this. How are you going to keep the project going even if there's no money? For the budget, I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to zip through this. People, you get salary, then you can calculate fringe benefits and indirect costs because your institution has standardized rates for that. It's usually the fully loaded with all three of those components is roughly double the salary. If you've got things, you've got to make sure that you've got those properly categorized, justified, quoted in many cases. If you've got subawards, make sure that that's carefully worked out and that the subawardee institutions and co-PIs or whoever they are understand precisely what they're supposed to do, have it in writing, a statement of work for each subaward, and so on and so forth. Cost share is either required or forbidden. If it's required, it's typically required with a very specific level, like 30% of total project budget is cost share and 70% is NSF funds or something like that. And it has to be done at exactly that level to the dollar. And there is no voluntary cost share. You can't have extra. And if there's no requirement for cost share, you're not allowed to have it at all. Typically, cost share has to be items that could otherwise be funded on the grant budget, and it typically has to be paid from non-federal funds. Now, on the other hand, you can have institutional commitment, which is not cost share, it's not required, and it's not forbidden. And it has some strange rules. I'm not going to go into the details because we're basically out of time, but there's some strange rules you should familiarize yourself with. And then there are various other components to the proposal. Again, not going to go into a lot of detail on all this stuff because of time, but just to give you the flavor, there's lots and lots of components. And in fact, for the biographical sketches and the current and pending support, they've got new forms. Current and pending support is driving me up a wall. The proposal that we submitted in January had over 600 pages. The overwhelming majority of that, I think more than 3/4 of the pages, were current and pending support forms, because the base form is 15 pages and you're not allowed to delete the parts of it that are blank. I hope they change that rule and say you can just include the pages that you actually put something in. But so far, they haven't said that. So we had to include the whole thing. Bio sketches, again, there's a form, and so on. You can also do it through a third-party system. I'm not going to go into the details. Okay, so here's acknowledgments for this stuff and for this program in general, the workshop in general, and I'd be happy to take a few questions. Usable LaTeX template for NSF proposals, yep. And if you haven't looked at overleaf.com, which is LaTeX on the web, I have found that to be very handy, and they often have useful templates for commonly used documents, especially documents used by academics. Let me see some of the other comments. Our first CC Star networking was not competitive. A year later, we got it funded. Right, and so that's, I think, exactly the way to think about this, that you may get it totally wrong the first time, but you'll get useful feedback to make it much better the second time for that resubmit. Okay, I applied for an MRI 4 years in a row. The 4th year, I didn't want to submit the proposal, but my VPR forced me to. I wrote it, and the process just about crushed me. And once it was submitted, I forgot about it. I thought it was awful, but that's the one that got funded. So I don't have quite that story, but I have had proposals funded that I thought were first draft go-arounds that I would resubmit the next year. And I did have to get my most recent MRI funded, I did have to submit it 4 times. And the key was just to never give up. Okay, I think that's it for, oh, there's some new messages. Hang on. We'll get to the new messages. Review. How long does the whole process take? Writing the proposal, I know there are people who can slap together a proposal in a week or even a few days. I ain't one of them. For me, writing a proposal takes months, largely because I can't really devote huge blocks of time to it, except as we get close to the deadline. So I try to give myself at least 3 months to write the proposal. The review process, typically it's 6 months from the time you submit it to the time there is a public announcement of which proposals are getting funded. That's not invariably true, but that's usually true. Usually a couple months before the official public announcement, if you're getting the money, you'll hear privately. Sometimes you'll hear privately if you've been declined. But hearing privately if you're recommended for the award is much higher probability. I'm sure there must be cases where it takes substantially less time than 6 months. I have not experienced that. I know there are cases where it can take substantially more time than 6 months. I haven't experienced that very often, although once or twice. Are there formal requirements to be an NSF reviewer? Do you need a PhD? No to both. Contact the relevant program officer, say you're available, give them a sense of the background, let them decide, which they're going to do anyway. For junior faculty, where can I find mini grants through NSF? There aren't a lot of those. There are unsolicited proposals, and you can submit a small dollar proposal, like a 5-figure proposal that way. I honestly haven't done much of that, so I don't know what the probability of success is on proposals like that. I believe it's the case that the program officer has the discretion to decide to fund proposals that are under $50,000. I know that's true with workshop proposals. I won't swear that's true with unsolicited proposals. Somebody else may know. Other questions? These are fun questions. Okay, then let's do this. I'm going to stop the recording.